In this video, we're going to move on to our second big rule around reducers. So with this rule, we say that reducers are supposed to produce or return state or data that is going to be used inside of our application, and the reducer has to do so using only the previous state from the last time that it was called and the action object that has been dispatched and is being passed into a given reducer. Now, understanding this text right here is a little bit challenging, so we're going to look at a diagram or two to help you really understand what's going on here. All right. This is a diagram of what happens to your reducer the very first time that it gets called inside of your application. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, when you first start up a Redux application, each reducer is going to be automatically called exactly one time. So it is an automatic invocation that essentially allows your reducers to specify some default state value. The first time your reducer gets called during that initialization process, it's going to receive two arguments. The first argument is going to have a value of undefined. And then the second argument will be some action object that we might refer to as action number 1, because it is the first action that the reducer is going to see. So it is then up to the reducer to take these two arguments right here and return some initial state value. Now, we really already went through this process right here back when we put together the songs application in the last section. I'm going to pull on some code from that application onto the screen really quickly. Okay, so here's our selected song reducer. So when our application first started up, selected song reducer was invoked automatically one time. Let's imagine that the code for invoking it one time was placed right here. So Redux internally did something like selected song reducer, and it passed in a first argument with a value of undefined. And then the second object is going to be some initialization action object. We don't really know what type that this action is going to have. We just know that it's going to be in there. It's going to be an action object with some mystery type property that we don't really know. So the first time that our reducer gets called, we're going to essentially look at that first argument right there and very quickly realize that it is undefined. That's why we put a default value for selected song right here. Remember what this syntax right here really does. It's a little bit of ES 2015 syntax that is essentially the equivalent of saying if selected song is equal to undefined, then change the value of selected song to be null instead. So again, the very first time we call the reducer, first argument is undefined. We don't really want to deal with that value of undefined, so we are going to default its value to instead be null. And that little option right there, that defaulting, is only going to take place the very first time that our reducer gets invoked. Remember, all the equals null right there does is check to see if selected song is equal to undefined. If it does, it's going to update the value of that argument to be null instead. We are not going to always default an argument like this to be equal to null. In many cases, we will instead default it to be an empty array, or it might be an empty string, or some number like the number 10 or something like that. It really just comes down to the purpose of the reducer that we are working on to decide on the default value. But in the case of selected song reducer, a default value of null made a lot of sense because that meant no, there is no currently selected value inside of our application. Okay, so I'm going to clean that up really quick, and we're going to flip back over to this diagram. Okay, so that's what happens the first time the reducer is called. Now, where things start to get really interesting is the second or third or fourth or fifth time that the reducer gets called. The next time, like the second time that this reducer gets called, the first argument is no longer going to be equal to the value undefined. Instead, it's going to be whatever the reducer returned the last time that it was ran. So you'll notice that the first time the reducer ran, it returned what we call state v1 right here. So the next time, the second time that the reducer gets called, the first argument will then be equal to state v1. So essentially that first argument into your reducer is always going to be whatever it returned the last time it was ran. So you can kind of imagine that we've got this kind of cyclic action where our reducer just keeps on getting called with its own value that is returning over and over again. And the only real change inside there is the action object. The only thing that changes each time the reducer gets called is that action object and the type and payload property inside of it. Okay, so that's what this second rule right here is talking about. Our reducer must return some data or some state using only the previous state value that it returned and the action object. So now that we have a better idea of rule number 2 right here, let's take a quick pause and we'll move on to rule number 3.